I'm going to welcome now Mr. Gregg Hurwitz, who's a writer, a screenwriter, a novelist, a thriller writer, a writer of comics, and so on and so forth. Over to you, Gregg.
Thank you so much. I must confess, after this murderer's row of thinkers, I feel a bit like Elizabeth Taylor's sixth husband. I know what I'm supposed to do, I'm just not sure how to make it interesting. But I would like to thank Dr. Conlon for at least lowering the bar and transition to an American accent. Stephen, I love the metaphor of the oak trees and the acorns, and I think that one of the things we're doing here is trying to figure out how Ralston and the people here and the people of Ralston and the rest of us can wind up being mighty oaks rather than squirrel food. And the key, as I see it, is that we all have to have roots in the dirt. We have to always have contact with reality, because when that fails, we don't have anything. So we're in a populist moment right now, but only sort of. We certainly have distrust of the people, by the people, and for the people. But I think of it a little bit differently, that we're in this cultural moment where the perpetuation of our supposedly shared beliefs, our values, our ideas, can no longer be taken for granted. They must be embodied and championed, and their continued purchase must be earned. If we want them to reflect what is high, we'd better ensure they are comprehensible on the ground. If we hope they embody what is good, we have to ensure that we embody what is good, and that that embodiment is evident, inspiring, and attractive to the real world. Because when we remove ourselves from reality, we float up into the abstract, and we become intellectually masturbatory. We trade on inside jokes and faculty lounge jargon, sealing ourselves in a cocoon of superiority and sanctimony, where we cease to convey and compete, where we ossify. Reality is where ideology goes to die. To have that which is highest and best, it must remain connected all the way down. It must be able to resonate through all quarters. And this is something I think a lot about in my career. I'm a writer of commercial fiction, crime fiction, thrillers. I have a series called Orphan X about an assassin trained in an off-the-books program buried deep beneath the DoD. And I describe my main character, Evan Smoke, as a blue-collar Renaissance man. And I, in fact, borrow a phrase from the OSS, the predecessor of the CIA, who said their ideal recruit is a PhD who could win a bar fight. So essentially, their ideal candidate was Joe Conlon. And Evan Smoke is indeed highly educated, but what do we mean by education? He's learned to scream at knife fighting, sniping, and demolition breaching. He studies military history and contemporary psyops. He learns nuances of foreign cultures, languages, and etiquette. But the reason for all of this learning is the same. If he's deep undercover and gets anything wrong, he will die. All of his learning is staked to the dirt. It can be glorious and compelling, sure, but he knows what he knows primarily, so he won't get killed. Of course, it's my aim to imbue my books with literary quality and narrative depth. But like my character, they can't merely jostle their way through an arid world of tote bag critics. My novels also have to compete evolutionarily. It's a kind of reproductive fitness aimed at producing more offspring off the presses. There's no differentiation between my reaching for highest possible artistic quality, the broadest reaching public, and prosperity. They're all the same. So why not aim at all of them? Isn't that what the greats have always done? It's not like Homer's goal of goals was to get the Odyssey published in a peer-reviewed literary journal subsidized by Vassar. Which, of course, that doesn't make sense since Homer was Greek and Vassar is in Poughkeepsie. But the point holds. The Bible, you talk about a perennial bestseller. When we think of Dickens or Hitchcock, we never ask the question, were they a commercial success or critical success? They embody both of them. After college, in case my aspirations of becoming a novelist didn't pay off and I needed surefire employment, I decided to acquire a master's degree in Shakespearean tragedy. And I often get asked, why does a Shakespeare scholar, I'm more like a Shakespeare dilettante, write thrillers? And the answer is, Shakespeare wrote narrative-driven, highly structured tales of lust, intrigue, and murder designed to put asses in seats and sell out the Globe Theater. If you cut the Globe Theater in half, it's a dollhouse view of a perfect cross-section of Elizabethan society. And the way that he modulates in tone and humor addresses that. He'll have a glancing reference to Ovid's Metamorphosis for royalty, and then he'll make a glancing joke about impotence for the groundlings. He's constantly moderating between all of these things. His aspiration, his top aim, quite literally, was to sell out. Literary cross-pollination between the popular and the profound abounds. Camus drew his inspiration for The Stranger from James M. Cain's The Postman Always Rings Twice, the great noir classic. I was rereading Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment recently, published in 1866, and I was halfway through and I had this inkling. I was thinking, there's no way that this guy didn't read Edgar Allan Poe. And I went through the notes, and sure enough, I found that he was a very big fan of Edgar Allan Poe. Telltale Heart, published in 1843. So here you have guilt and emotional paranoia driving a murderer to confession, conveyed through two means. And what a lovely synergy between the inventor of the mystery, Poe's truly the inventor of the modern mystery, and perhaps the greatest psychological novelist of all time. In the preface to Dorian Gray, Oscar Wilde famously remarks, "There's no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all." So perhaps we can paraphrase. There's no such thing as highbrow art or popular art. Art is good or bad. That is all. And when it's great, it's both highbrow and popular. And as for commercial considerations, they too are as old as time. It's not like Michelangelo could paint whatever the hell he wanted on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. He had to answer to the head of the studio, Pope Julius II. And so here we are now, at the start of a new renaissance of sorts, if we don't screw it up. There's a fresh air of optimism, a sense of high human possibility across the arts. And if culture is the soil that we live in, it's time for us to consider what seeds should we plant. So perhaps we can ask ourselves, what is highest and best and most widely received? And I propose that those three considerations form a new trinity that will join us in community and help us understand ourselves better, who we are and what we want to aim at. So what does this mean about Ralston? Ralston is by definition elite. We have 26 students selected out of 11 million applicants. You all teach courses in languages I can't read, and I went to Harvard and Oxford back when that was still something to be proud of. But what else do you have at Ralston? You have carpenter painters and horse breakers. You have trumpeters and architects, farmers and fishermen and filmmakers. As students, you're tasked with more than just sniffing rarefied air. You're tasked with carrying principles and patterns forward in your real life, in your real relationships, in your real communities. The fundamental questions, truth, beauty, mortality, justice, have purchase in the real world. And the responsibility of Ralston graduates and of anyone who touches this community is to go forth as school teachers and entrepreneurs, soldiers and publishers, veterinarians and computer engineers, to plant seeds, to grow the culture wider and stronger, to ensure that the virtues prosper and propagate. Best, highest, and most attractive. That's not just Stephen Blackwood. It is the responsibility and the goal for all of us to identify, judge, embody, and carry our learning far and wide into the world. Thank you.